Welcome, I'm Mel Long from MDV, and I'm delighted to be joined by Karen Ellis again today for this fourth session in our series of 6 virtual webinars. I can't believe that when we conceived of these, they really have raced past, and we've absolutely been thrilled to be able to do them. So to be here for number 4 is very exciting. And today is all about relational resilience. And as with our previous sessions, we're going to split this session into 2. So Karen is going to take us through some fantastic habits, practices and tools around relational resilience for the first part. And then I'll be leading us through a digestif for the second part, where I'll be thinking about and talking about and exploring the concept of love in the workplace and whether we believe it's important or relevant. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Karen, who's going to kick us off for today's session. Over to you, Karen.
Hello everyone, good afternoon just about. It's nice to be here again and working on the theme of resilience again, and particularly working on the theme of relational resilience. And I'm going to be talking about both how our relationships can support our resilience and also how they can actually sometimes get in the way or cause us stress. Obviously it's a very quick canter, we've only got half an hour. At the end of the half an hour, I'm going to take us through a very brief Qigong exercise, because we are talking about physiological resilience often as much as we're talking about psychological or social resilience. But what I wanted to do just before we start is say to everybody, if you have been locked in your chair doing video conferences for the last however many weeks it is, you might want to stand up, you might want to wander around, you might want to adopt one of the positions I showed you in the physiological resilience session. So the constructive rest position, which is lying on your back with your knees up and your feet immediately under your knees, or even the constructive rest position where you can see I set up a chair and you can lie flat on your back with your knees up and your lower legs resting on a pillow. If you're going to adopt a position that is not sitting and looking at the screen, please turn your video off. And if you feel you wish to do any light yoga as we're working, please do. I'm just very conscious of all of this sitting fixated at screens that we're doing at the moment, and it's not helping any of us. So a little bit of Qigong at the end just to liven us up before Mel's section, and let's get going. So Mel, can you drive my slides? So those of you who were here at session 2 will remember I had a little picture of a thing called a tardigrade, the most resilient creature on the planet, and today our resilience hero is this terrapin who is clearly learning to balance on his shell, because most of the theme of today is about balance and equilibrium. So those of you who were here at session 2, sorry Malcolm, thank you. Those of you who are here at session 2, remember that I was trying to talk about the principles of resilience rather than just talking about tips. There's loads of good tips out there on the web about how to stay resilient during this period, but I wanted to sort of broaden out and think about the principles. So we talked about 3 different aspects of resilience, which I'll come to in a second. But today we're going to focus specifically on dynamic equilibrium. We're going to understand some of the features of relationships that are resilient. We'll introduce a bit of a relationship recovery practice, because a lot of us are having bumps in our relating at the moment for reasons that I'll come into later. And also help you think about 2 of your own important relationships in terms of their dynamic balance. Okay, so let's just remind ourselves, what does resilience really mean? It's our ability to cope with stress and catastrophe, to bounce back to homeostasis or equilibrium, and to use our learning to improve our resistance to negative events. So I was talking to you in the first session about 3 key concepts: recovery, dynamic equilibrium, and adaptability. Recovery is what we need to do in the short term. Equilibrium is what gives us medium-term balance, and adaptability is what allows us to really spread our resilience over a long-term set of situations. So last time we focused mainly on recovery, and today we're going to go more into dynamic equilibrium. So I said right at the beginning that relationships are both a positive and a potentially negative effect on our personal resilience. We are social animals, and so what is happening in our social setting and in our close relationships always affects our emotional state and our mental state, and that can be for good or ill. So just a reminder again, we talked about how we recover from shocks, and I use this graphic to give the idea of what happens when we have a life shock, and then we gradually settle down to equilibrium again. But what I also want to talk about today is how you increase the range of things which you can cope with. So most of us, as we grow up and develop, learn to cope with more and more difficult situations, more different types of difficult situations as we go along. And that's what I mean by increasing the envelope of your resilience over time. It's one of the things that hopefully as we get older confers wisdom, not always, but that's one of the ideas of wisdom, is that we have a wider range of experiences and events that we can cope with. So we talked a little last time about the vagus nerve and how important that is in the body, and it's the main manager of our parasympathetic nervous system. It helps us cope with shocks, and our ability to manage our vagus nerve or vagal nerve tone is important in healing. And there's a reference to that on the section on the website for the last event. So if we can damp the shocks to our system, if we can learn techniques, both physiological, psychological, and relational, we will be able to recover from shocks more easily. So in some ways, our relational network can help us to build resilience. We all know that social isolation has a very negative effect on long-term health, both physical health and mental health. And if we only have a few points of support in our lives, then actually we're not very resilient because we don't have a flex, and we always end up drawing on the same one or two people to help us. If we have multiple supporting relationships, some of those will be friendships, but they might be close colleague relationships. They might even be people that you hang out on the allotment with, as some of my friends are doing at the moment. They may be just friendly acquaintanceships. They all help us to manage our resilience because of that social aspect of our well-being. So this is a little picture from a book or an idea that was developed by Stephen Porges, Dr. Stephen Porges, who wrote about the idea of polyvagal theory. So what he's saying is that not only do we have this idea of fight and flight, which sits at the middle of our vagal system, sometimes actually our vagal system can shut us down completely, and that's what looks like freeze or collapse. But we also have a part of our vagal system which is higher up, called the ventral vagal system, which is the bit of us that causes us to go and get support from others, to engage, to talk to people. And what Porges is saying is, as stress increases, we move our strategies down from the top. So first of all, when we're stressed, we tend to look for social support. We tend to go and talk to people. We tend to try and find out what they're up to. We look to other humans to see how they're interacting. Then if we're not getting good feedback from there, we start to go into fight, flight. And then at the worst case scenario, we start to shut down. And anyone who's seen somebody go into a sudden stress will know how quickly that can happen, but it also happens over time. So this idea of our social system being part of our own vagal system is very important. And the network is kind of an extended way of managing your resilience. So ideally, if we're able to have a good network of people who are supportive, who are able to manage their own anxiety states, their own frustration, our envelope broadens. However, on the downside, it's also true that our relationships can cause us stress. So when you look at the 4 biggest stress tendencies in most people's lives, the things that they report causing them stress, there's the obvious immediate issue around adverse events, so sudden shocks, being made redundant, your partner being told that they've got a nasty diagnosis, your children failing all their exams. Those are all immediate adverse events. The experience of overload can stress people over the long term, simply having too much to do, too much to manage, and that can be too many relationships to manage as much as anything else. In a medium-term setting, uncertainty tends to affect us as humans. We don't like uncertainty. We like to be able to plan, to feel under control. But then the last one is this idea that actually interpersonal trouble, interpersonal bumps can have both immediate effects and really shock us, especially when it's unexpected. But over the long term, being in an environment where the relationships aren't supportive, where we're not feeling lots of balance, over the long term, that can reduce our envelope as well. So in our relational lives, we're in this dichotomy of possible effects on our resilience. One is hopefully the relationships support us and make us more resilient, but also when we have relationship difficulties, they actually close our envelope up. So that's the idea that the stressor will actually make us less resilient to the next shock. So those of you who've noticed that in yourselves over time will notice that at some point in your own stress response, even the most minor thing, which is usually for me, the tech falling over, or me not being able to cook something properly and getting really frustrated and throwing things around the kitchen. I don't actually throw things, but you know what I mean. Things that wouldn't normally bother me at all make me flip out much more easily. And that's the idea that my equilibrium envelope has been over time reduced. So relationships and the emotional economy. I said last time that we met that I would talk a bit about anxiety contagion. Anxiety can be passed between humans in a variety of different ways, both directly, as you'll know if you've ever seen a crowd panic, where actually the emotional tone, the sense we're giving off, the feeling of our bodies is causing the contagion, but it also happens in our ways of communicating. So at the moment, we're in this peculiar situation, which we don't need to refer to again, but there's a global trade in anxiety. There are many media, many people that are trying to ramp up or inadvertently trying to be helpful, but actually ramping up the level of anxiety. And these are different pictures from the media that are really sort of exacerbating that. And the little picture at the bottom is showing protect yourself from coronavirus by washing your hands, disinfecting, wearing a mask, and not using your mobile phone. So that's really the idea that actually we need to protect ourselves from the anxiety as much as we need to protect ourselves from the virus. So then what you might want to do if you think about your social network is think about the next question. How do you interact with your local anxiety economy? So you are in an anxiety economy locally, and depending on how broadly you're interacting with people, that might be global or it might be very physically local, but it's your local community. When anxiety gets passed around, you will notice that both you and other people have a tendency. The first tendency is to be an anxiety amplifier, where something comes into you and you spread it around to 10 people and you really heighten the feeling tone as you're doing that. And you get very breathless and you go, oh my God, what's this thing that's happening now? So that's the idea that we actually amplify anxiety unhelpfully for others. Some of us go to the opposite extreme and we swallow everybody's anxiety. We go, it's all fine, everything's fine, I can manage, let me take care of it. And this is particularly strong in workplaces. If you're an anxiety swallower, you will notice that you take in anxiety more and more, it actually affects your own physiological state, and eventually, usually, unlike this snake, most anxiety swallowers will explode because there is a limit to how much you can swallow it on your own. So that brings me to the relational response, which is to learn to damp the anxiety. So to say to the person who's passing you the anxious information or the anxious state, I really get how that must be affecting you. That's completely understandable. I think that we should try and manage this together, but I'm not going to manage it for you. So let's think about what you might do. Let's think about how you might change your state. So you make it a shared responsibility to reduce the anxiety between you, rather than either taking it on all yourself or actually amplifying it and spreading it around. So that's just a sort of little metaphorical idea about a sort of contagion that can happen in these situations. And also it can happen in our normal day-to-day life when actually there's an anxious thing going on in a family or an organization, and how are we responding to that? So that's a little map I wanted to put in your heads for thinking about how you're responding at the moment. So back to, oh yes, I forgot about this one. Thank you, Mel. This is a set of linguistic viruses from a book called You Are What You Say, actually originating in the work of Fernando Flores. And this is the sort of thing that's going on at the moment. In particular, there are 10 linguistic viruses, and these are just 4 of them. I'll talk about the other 6 in the next session. We've all seen a lot of treating opinions as truths, all the fake news and false information that's going on around the virus, making statements without rigorous grounds. Lockdown is going to end because of this, lockdown's never going to end because of that, but there's no actual evidence on either side. Making fantasy statements and great declarations. We are going to use this experience to overturn global capitalism. Well, that might be true, but at the moment it is just a fantasy and a great declaration. So that's another thing that can spread the contagion. And then also, this is a more personal one. If you are somebody who has an expectation of the people around you and you're not communicating that, that will create contagion as well. That's the bit where your own behavior, your expectations are playing out with people in an unspoken way, and they can't work out what you want. This is the expecting the people around you to be mind readers situation. So all of those things I think are going on at the moment in the world, probably amplified from usual, and we all have to take care of them and make sure that we're not actually contributing to any of those behaviors. So dynamic equilibrium and relationships. We all talk about balance a lot, but the question is, what kind of balance have we got in the relationship? So what I'd like you to do for the next 10 minutes or so is to think of 2 relationships that matter to you, one more from your home or family life or friend life, and one from your work life. They have to be relationships where there is goodwill. You have a sense that you both feel warm to each other. They have to be relationships where you believe that both you and the other person have positive intent. So you want to be helpful to each other. You're actively engaged with each other. It's not just somebody you like to wave to in the corridor who you think is nice. And it's a peer-like relationship. So don't choose a relationship where you're the parent or the child or the boss or the report. So think about somebody with whom, or 2 people with whom you're in a peer relationship, which is characterized with goodwill and positive intent, and hold that relationship in your mind the next 10 minutes. Okay, so balance in relating. So I wanted to just create the distinction between static equilibrium. So we can think of balance as being able to hold ourselves in perfect uniformity, as these 2 gymnasts are doing. They are actually in equilibrium, but it's not very dynamic. And what that means is it might not survive a shock. So if I give them a push from the side, actually, this is not a very stable equilibrium, because it's very still and it's very static and relies on a certain state of affairs to be true. If we then look at these dancers, these guys are in dynamic equilibrium. It is the very fact that they're both able to move that is holding the female dancer in the balance, and the male dancer is acting as an equilibrator for her, but they're able to do that in movement. And what we want to feel in our relationships is that there is a dynamic in the relationship that creates stability for us, regardless of any change in circumstance. So in a given relationship with another person, there are 2 sorts of balance. And the first sort of balance is the balance between you. The first idea I want to put here is this idea of a balance between giving and receiving. So this is kind of the archetypal balance in a relationship. Hopefully, both people in any relationship are able to both give and receive in the relationship. And this term in particular comes from Bert Hellinger, who was the founder of constellation theory. And this idea of fair exchange of giving and receiving is very important in social stability. When we feel that the exchange is not fair, then we start to get grumpy and upset, and also sometimes want to leave the relationship. Obviously, there are some relationships, like the relationship between parents and children, and sometimes between boss and report, where there is a propensity on one side to be the giver versus the receiver, but over time that should equilibrate out. So giving and receiving is kind of the archetypal balance between 2 people, and it can show up in different ways. So one person might be the nurturer, the other person might be the person that depends on the nurturing. Those of you who've got elderly parents at the moment will feel that very strongly, probably, at the moment, where you're having to do a lot of things for them in order for them to be okay, and they might be feeling uncomfortable about feeling dependent on you. Another one is about the difference between deciding and following. One person in the group being the person who makes most of the decisions, who's the active participant, one being the more following kind of participant who's happy to let the other person make the choices. And then the third one is the balance between expressing and listening. Those of you who are introverted know that you can spend all your time listening if you don't ever start learning to express. And those of you who are extroverted will know that sometimes it's a real challenge to listening. I don't mean that all extroverts are always expressing and all introverts are always listening, but that's a bit of a tendency. So just for a moment in the chat box, we'd be interested to hear from you about any other balances you can think of in relationship. What might be other things that you feel need to balance, or that you notice that you're balancing in your own relationships?
Yeah, we've got a comment, Karen, that it's a great way of thinking about it. So that's absolutely agree with that. Very good to reflect on relationships in that way. Asserting versus compromising's come up. So thank you, Francois.
That's a good one.
Time together, time alone.
Yeah.
Thanks, Mike.
Exactly. So rationality versus values and feelings, some of the typical Myers-Briggs ones.
We've got another one here. Money is interesting when in relationships, so abundance, a scarcity.
Very good. Yes. Yeah. An attitude that we have more than enough versus we need more. Thank you.
And play and seriousness has come through as well, Karen.
Good. That one. Well, that's a spoiler. So I've got that one later. Good. Okay. So just as a quick exercise over the next minute or two, people are putting some more in. We'll capture these and we'll put them on a slide to add to the main slide pack. So the Critical question in a relationship is this a static balance or a dynamic balance? Does one person polarize into a certain sort of position and hold that position tightly, while the other person has to take the corresponding role? Or, in the example of the seesaw, is it a bit more able to manage through a process of give and take? So, just as a 2-minute exercise, think of your two relationships. Pick one polarity that seems to be in play in that relationship. Think about your part in that polarity. Which end do you tend to hold? When does that tendency show up? Are there any times when you're willing to switch or you switch? If you would like to rebalance the system, how might you experiment with shifting your end of the bargain? So I don't know if you remember the people in the tug of war. Obviously, it takes both people to hold the two ends of the rope in a tug of war. And while that might be quite stable while we're both holding the rope, if we are willing to put our side down, then the other person might have time to move. So often what we think about in relationships is, how can I get that person to do something different? Well, actually, if we stop holding up our end of the bargain, then we might actually change the dynamic. This is just a health warning about that action, though. If you're going to get off the seesaw, warn the person at the other end. So sometimes we can get a bit frustrated with our friends and our partners and our colleagues and go, right, I'm not going to do that thing anymore. I'm just going to get off. And the other person is left flailing by the change in behaviour, and probably will start by strengthening their polarity because they can't work out where the other person has gone. So we should always do these things transparently and openly if we're going to change a dynamic. So that's about the idea about the balance between the two people. We also need balance in the qualities of our relationships. So relationships have different ways of, different atmospheres, different feelings, and sometimes we can both get stuck in a certain way of operating rather than polarizing. So for example, the idea of togetherness and separateness, we actually around each other too much and we have too much attention on our togetherness, we forget to manage our separateness. And as somebody pointed out earlier, this can polarize between people as well as within the quality of the relationship. Another quality that can get stuck is too much playfulness or too much seriousness. Some of our relationships can get very intense and focused and we forget to play in them. Some of our relationships are so kind of light that when a difficult thing happens to one person, we don't know how to handle it. Some relationships are very supportive, have no challenge and get really stultified. Some relationships are too challenging, and that can create friction and raise levels of anxiety, again, when one party needs support. And there are others. So there's, you can think of as many of these as you like. So the difference between this idea and the polarizing idea is sometimes we both have to realize, oh, actually our relationship has become two. We're both doing the same thing. We're symmetrically reinforcing a certain quality in the relationship rather than allowing a bit of give and take. So again, think of your two relationships. Pick 3 words to describe the qualities of the relationship. For one of those words, pick an opposite or polarized quality and think about, would it actually help this relationship to have more of that quality? Now, if you've picked harmonious as one of your ends, you might not want to pick the quality of argumentative. You might decide that that's never useful, for example, but there may be something that you think of its opposite polarity as actually something you want to incorporate in the relationship. And if that quality would help, how might you experiment with the other person to bring that aspect more to bear? So I just wanted to go back to the idea of recovery that we covered in the first session and think about how do we actually manage to recover from a relationship, even if it is one that has a sense of balance. Sometimes our relationships get bumped. So we are probably all, well, the vast majority of us are in a slightly heightened version of stress or a strongly heightened version of stress, depending on our life situation at the moment. And there are various things that are created by the situation, particularly the situation of lockdown, that are creating a greater tendency to relational bumps. People are more anxious, so they're getting a bit more fractious. We're having to manage with very unfamiliar situations like this chap at his desk with his face mask on. And a lot of us are crowding at the moment because we're all at home with people that we wouldn't normally be spending a lot of time at home with. I'm hoping that most of you are still in a good relational situation. And actually, I noticed there has, and I have reported by my friends, there's a definite outbreak of niceness and kindness and courtesy in most family environments, because everybody knows that they need to keep things harmonious if they can, but that's not always the case. So if we do have a bump, then this is a different way of thinking about it. So we talked in our second session about this idea that what actually causes upset is a stopped process. So we get upset because we're trying to go on in our way, get our things done, interact with the world in the way that feels good for us, and then something stops us. And sometimes focusing on what got stopped rather than focusing on the upset can be a really useful way of decoding what has happened to us. If that bump has been caused by somebody else, so for example, I really, really wanted to have some time and on my own watching my favorite box set, but everybody else in my family wants to sit in the same room with me and interact with me as I'm watching it. I've been stopped from doing something that I wanted to do. You'll be able to think of all sorts of day-to-day examples of this. So if we think about psychological relational recovery, it's the same as the process for psychological recovery. The first thing we have to do is calm ourselves down because our arousal level's gone up. Then we need to detach from the situation. We need to work out what's actually bothered us here, rather than just going, can you all get out of the living room? Work out what it is that is really bothering us in the situation, and then hopefully enact that by having a conversation. So if we think about stop process, we can collaborate over a number of different aspects of a stop process. If it's something we can't do, how can we ask the other person to help us with the thing that we wanted to try and do? If it's something we feel we couldn't say to them, how can we find a way to say it? If it's that we wanted someone to meet a need of ours, how might we help them to get them to help us with that expectation? So these recovery conversations don't have to be big and long-winded. We don't have to all sit down and have a family conference. We can just have a recovery conversation in 4 sentences. So for example, we can give the frame. This is what I think happened when we had that spat earlier on, or when we bumped. I realized I was upset because I was no longer able to, or I didn't feel able to say, or I wanted you to, one of those kind of ideas, a stopped process impact. Then make a request. Would you be willing to help me too? Always knowing that the other person has the right to say no, and that we might have to then think about how we're going to manage that situation for ourselves. And usually it's good to make a promise at the same time, because that balances out the request. So we can say to the person, if I want to have some time on my own, I promise I will tell you, and we can negotiate how long that's going to be. So this idea of a frame, an impact, a request and a promise brings back a balance to a situation where one of us has got off kilter. The eagle-eyed among you will notice that I haven't really referred to feelings here, and how the event made me feel. Sometimes that's useful and sometimes it's actually not, because then we can get into a discussion of whether you should have felt like that, or whether the person intended you to feel like that, or some other way of managing the emotional thing, when actually what matters is the ability to move the thing on so that we can both get what we need. Obviously, there's an equal and opposite requirement on us to be able to notice when we've bumped other people, and perhaps to ask some questions that help them work out what it is that's causing them the bump in their own experience and how we might help them get over it. So this balance of giving, receiving, being able to tell people what we need, to express our requests, being able to ask them what they need from us, is part of that dynamic equilibrium that keeps things together. So I think that's all I'm going to do for today. The 2 slides about the qualities of good relationship conversation, we'll put those on the website so you can see those, as I had to run over those quite quickly. So those of you who are able to stay, I just wanted to take you through a quick Qigong exercise, because that might help us all in the weeks to come. So if you feel like standing up, stand up. If you feel like staying sitting down, you can stay sitting down. So this is an exercise that helps us to get moving when we've got stuck, helps us to interact with our own bodies, helps us to manage our breathing, not because we're managing our breathing, but because the exercise itself creates that impact. Those of you who've done Qigong will recognize it. I'm just going to change my screen a little bit. So we're just going to rotate while letting our arms hang. So it's very important in this exercise not to fix your lower body. So you're allowing your legs to move with you, you're allowing your foot to come off the floor in each rotation, and you're just letting your arms come round as you spin. Notice your breathing, breathe as normally as you can. And if you feel able to, and you don't have physical limitations, if you do, don't do this bit, you can speed up. You can swing around more. You can let your arms come higher up your body. And you can allow your arms and your hands to slap yourself. Sometimes you can actually get to your kidneys on the back. And you can get to your ribs on the front. And you can do this as vigorously as you like. If you've got no limitations, your back's good, you can spin around. And actually, doing this for 2 or 3 minutes every hour or so will get your blood pumping, your body moving, and allow you to create some energy in your world, especially if you've been sat down for the last 2 hours on a video conference. You can bend your legs, you can bounce as much as you like to make it work. We've got a link to some really good Qigong. Sorry, I shouldn't have done that. Gradually then slow down and bring yourself back to a standing position. And hopefully you'll notice that your breathing is a bit deeper and a bit more oxygen giving for you. And then if you settle back down into whatever position you want to listen to Mel in, you can either sit or do one of the lying down positions, which I'm going to do. And just allow your breathing to settle in that process. So that's an exercise which does all 3 things of potentially calming, grounding, and reconnecting with your own body. And we'll do some more next time in session 6. Okay, Mel, I'm going to hand over there and have a little lie down.
Thank you so much, Karen. And as ever, I mean, wonderful, physical, engaging, fantastic habits and practices. And I can see lots of comments from chat, people saying just how helpful it is. So thank you so much. So we're now moving on to the second part of today's webinar. So our digestive. But if you're staying, get comfortable, relax, and we're going to talk about love. And I'm not going to break into song. And I did think, having had What's Love Got to Do It with it as the title, I should have a song for each slide, but my song repertoire ran out. So as you're in chat, if you come up with some inspiration, add them in. We can all break into song later if we want to. So this is really building on the topic of relational resilience. And I suppose the question that I had was, what has love got to do with work? And is the concept relevant in our working lives? And why did I think this? Really, I wanted to build on the wonderful sessions that are the digestives that Julie has brought to us in the past sessions, where she's focused on some of the work of Roger Steer, the corporate philosopher. And with today's focus, there were some further insights in his work that stimulated some thoughts for me that I wanted to share with you. For those who weren't able to join previous sessions or aren't familiar with Roger, you can obviously look at the recordings to hear what Julie was saying, but just as a sort of snapshot, he features very strongly in the corporate world as a result of his thinking around the world of ethics. And in about 2008, Steer and a fellow psychologist actually designed a psychometric tool. I'll just put my teeth in, the Ethicability tool, which really measures how we prefer to make moral decisions and the moral values that we bring to those decisions that we make. And he talked about 3 perspectives on moral decision making. One of logic and reason, so trying to come up with a well-reasoned right answer or right decision, regardless perhaps of consequences, rules, or other issues. And then the ones of law or obedience. So really taking into account the rules, thinking about whether you want to obey or disobey, and being aware of the consequences perhaps of reward or punishment within that. He also brought up the social conscience or love or care. And really, this was about decision making that takes into account individuals and the group. So decisions almost based on empathy. He also brought up 10 moral values. I'm not going to go through those in detail today, but just so you can see them here, wisdom, fairness, courage, self-control, and Julie covered these in a little bit more detail in previous sessions. So if you do want to kind of dig into that a little bit more, either looking at Roger Steer's site, moraldna.org, or looking at our previous webinar content, will give you a bit more of a sense of those. But as I dug a bit deeper into his work, what I saw was that he was also shining a light on how our morality evolves over time and as we mature. So you see on this graph three lines. We've got love, logic, and law. And as you look across our age profile, you see that our preference for logic increases greatly as we mature and continues to increase as we get older. Our preference for law shows a bit of a downward trend as we get older, but our preference for love as we reach adulthood stays pretty constant. And Steer's work was really underpinned by Kohlberg, theory of moral development, which helped us to understand the shift in law and logic, but also the work of Carol Gilligan and her different voice, which brought in the concept of love and saying that actually, you know, in mature morality, how can you separate considerations of personal relationships and care from the sort of impartiality of how we make moral decisions. Then as I dug a bit deeper, and thanks to Julie's insights, we can see that in the workplace, so on that left-hand side image, our preference for law and logic dominate, but our preference for love and our consideration of love when we're thinking about moral decisions isn't so present. And that got me thinking, what's the impact of that? You know, we clearly need to comply, we want to make the right decisions, but what is the impact of that decline? And that was a question that Steer was asking as well. And then if we dig a bit deeper and we look on the right-hand side, you can see those 10 moral virtues that Julie looked at and how they change and how they show up in decision making as we get to more senior levels in an organization. And what struck me was the dominance of courage, hope, wisdom, all those things as you get to more senior levels, which I suppose one can understand as the world gets more complex and organizations are struggling to survive and thrive no more so than now. It's really important that we bring all our knowledge, our wisdom, our courage to take the tough decisions, to make things happen in the workplace. But humility and love are on the decline, as you see that sort of pink and mauve or purple line. And then I also see there's a difference in perspective for employees and senior leaders. So actually that disconnect or the divide between love and humility is widening between those two populations. So is that suggesting an unmet need for employees and a blind spot for senior leaders? So it just got me thinking. And within all this context of surviving and thriving and being successful, also individuals, so employees and senior leaders, are facing their own struggles with uncertainty around the world of work. Rationalization and rise of technology is leaving people wondering, what will my role be? What will my identity be? We've also got individuals facing great complexity in their home lives, juggling multiple demands, multi-generational care needs, probably more so now than ever, and also dual careers. So lots of complexity, lots of struggle in our home lives. And dare I mention COVID-19 again, but that brings so much more struggle to people in terms of health and financial concerns. So got me thinking, I don't think there's a time when we could argue that love isn't more needed. We know it's a core human need, but despite all that, it seems to be, from this data, that it's perhaps not showing up as much in the workplace as it should do. And you could argue that maybe work becomes a little bit lovelessness, and actually we need more of it. So if we think outside of the business context, for centuries, we've heard about the power and virtue of love and how it helps humans to flourish. So if just about everybody on the planet sees the centrality and the importance of love, and sees it as a universal good and something that helps with our well-being in the context of work where we spend the bulk of our waking hours, why might it be that we're having to leave that part of ourselves at home? So that raised the question for me. So I thought it'd be good to explore, what has love got to do with work? Have we got the right balance, or should it be that the balance between love, logic and law is shifting? And is love really there? We're just not seeing it, or is it not relevant? So before I move on, I'd really love just to get your perspective. So a quick poll in chat, if I may. How relevant do you think love is at work? So you can either give me the thumbs up or thumbs down or a yay or a nay, but just love to hear what you're thinking at the moment. Very relevant. Thank you, Claire. Very. Okay. Yep. Yep. So lots of very's so far. Yep. Thank you, Mike. Thumbs up. More relevant. Yes, Alison, I think more relevant. Very much needed. Yep. Okay. So we're getting a bit of a consensus that probably is of relevance. So please feel free to add anything else as we go through. But what I thought I'd just do is do the science bit or the research bit. So I did some digging around the research in, I suppose, the field of modern management or organizational world to see what's out there. And you know, it's not the richest vein of research, but the evidence does suggest that love does matter in the workplace. And the findings are revealing that working a loving, caring culture can have many positive impacts on performance. And also it's showing that people who feel they can express affection, that they can care, they can show compassion for one another, are more positive and satisfied. Other researchers, rather than sort of just look into it, said to people, you know, how important do you think love is? And a little bit what you said, you know, it's hugely relevant, it's much needed. And they were saying, we work best as humans if we're in a loving environment. It's a fundamental. And then also people were saying, well, why wouldn't we consider it in the workplace? You know, why would it not be relevant if it's important in life? And others also said, well, it's a counterbalance, isn't it? It's that thing of counterbalancing all that rationality, all that efficiency, all that competitive advantage that we're driving for. And I think, you know, setting aside research, if you think to your own experience when you've worked in an emotional culture that's perhaps detached or at worst hostile, how do you feel? You know, you feel a bit depleted, you don't feel fulfilled. And eventually, for some people, that can lead to burnout if you don't have that source of love and care and compassion from other people. And then, you know, taking my rational hat, productivity can suffer as well. So it hurts the well-being of employees, it hurts organizations, but it also hurts how successful organizations can be. So then I started to sort of think, right, where is this research around love? And found some work by Duncan Coombe, so professor from IMD, who had asked the question, you know, how important is love? It is important. And he surveyed many executives from a wide range of organizations, from financial services to charities to sports, you know, different fields. And his work really challenged that assumption, because what he was able to discover was actually love is relevant and love does have a place in the work, and is, you know, is around us. So at a time when, you know, more than ever, we need to be able to bring our full selves to work, feel able to have our concerns listened to, understood, and have people around us who can help us problem solve and who can help us deal with some of the challenges, you know, to Karen's point, not dwell in our emotional swimming or water, but actually move beyond that and think about what we can do with those situations. I really wanted to share some of his research findings and really pose those as thoughts for you to take back to your organizations and really think about what we can do to amplify love right now. So one of the first areas that I think Coombe and many others, and Cara and I were talking about this the other day, you know, love is a really difficult thing to define. It's really hard because the first thing that comes to mind is romance, passion, you know, and we can't separate, or we find it hard to separate it from the romantic or religious connotations that we use. And using it in the workplace kind of feels a little bit awkward. You know, start saying you love your colleagues, or inappropriate, or odd, or flaky, or unprofessional, so all sorts of words that come to mind when you think about it. And actually, you know, in English language, it's a bit challenging for us because we only have one word. So the limits of our language mean that we actually sort of fall back on our societal obsession and focus with romance as love rather than move beyond that. And as ever, the ancient Greeks come up trumps, and they have a wonderful plethora of terms to describe love, which I just thought I'd share here. And that enables us to start to bring language and nuance to what we mean by love, and think about how that can be relevant to work. So we've got eros, which is our, you know, passion, lust, romantic, passionate love. We've got philia, which is that sort of kinship, friendship, intimacy, soul to soul bonding. We've got Ludus, the sort of playful, flirtatious love, probably the one with no obligations, if you like. And we've got Storge, which is this protective kinship love that you think of in relation to family. So you love your sister, you love your husband, your father, but sometimes, you know, there's a rub around, you might not like them as much. Philautia, so self-love, brings two concepts to mind. So we've got the concept of care based on self-esteem, so looking after yourself, giving yourself some love, you know, a massage or a present when you've done something really well. And then we've also got the sort of more sort of narcissistic self-love, so more focus on self and perhaps selfishness. Pragma, so this is committed or companionate love, which is probably the type of definition that's more used with organizations. And then we've got agape, which is empathic or universal love. So love without requirement. You're thinking about humanity, you're thinking very empathically and universally about love and society. And I noticed in chat, Mike's added Liebe, German, thank you, and Kirill saying the same. And I think Diego saying from Spain, feel I can say more often I love friends or peers in Spanish than in English. Yes, so thank you, Diego, for sharing that. Other areas, so in organizational research, companionate love comes out, but other researchers said, actually, do you know what, we're not even going to bother defining it, we're just going to ask people what it means. So what does it actually mean? And yes, Brendan, intellectual love, I love that one. So researchers spoke to a number of people and said, what do you mean? And they said, well, it's empathy, it's care, it's listening, it's compassion, it's accepting people, warts and all. It's you know, accepting people for who they are, which I think is important. So how would you define love? And I see, Francois, you're saying je t'aime, yeah, to a colleague, challenging, makes me think of another song, but I really shouldn't go there. So quickly in a poll, what would you define as love in the workplace? What words would you use to describe it? And yes, younger generations tell that, yeah, absolutely, love each other all the time. Thank you, Brendan. So any other definitions or words that you would use? Mutual respect, yep. Brilliant. Yep. So similar sorts of things that are coming out. And as I said, I really love this concept of accepting people for who they are. So let's talk about some of the other things that came out, the research from Coombe. So I think we all know building people up, thank you, and taking others' needs into account, brilliant. So one of the things I think I recognize from my time in corporate is that when you get a concept, everyone's like, great, let's write it down, let's codify it, let's give people a set of actions, behaviors, let's put it on the wall. And what came out from the research that Coombe did was that those organizations that were focusing on it didn't do that. They were saying, actually, you need to think of love as an intent, a philosophy, a mindset, something that you hold within you when you act or when you behave or when you think. And it can therefore play out in multiple contexts. And he referred to it a bit like an operating system, which I thought was a great way of describing it. So not necessarily obvious from the outside, but it's behind the scenes, it's powering this integrated functioning of the system, however you want to describe the system. So trying not to limit it to words that might limit, as with our English language, what you actually mean by it. The other thing that was important was love is not fluffy. So a lot of the people were saying, actually, love is about having those open and honest conversations, facing into conflict, saying the things that really need to be said, as Karen was talking about earlier. If you genuinely care for someone, you genuinely want to give them the honest feedback. And I think, you know, the concept of tough love was very much raised by people, and saying that it's not about compliance, it's not confluence, it's not slavish or insincere commitment or harmony, it's actually sort of facing into, and yes, thank you, Jane, she's talking about Power and Love by Adam Kahane, so some good references coming through here. So it's a chance to be honest with each other. The other thing I think that's, well, I think we're seeing right now, but couldn't be more relevant with COVID and everything that's going on, is expression of love is not just limited to within your organizational system, but Coombe found that those organisations that saw it as present and were concerned about it were extending it out to their partners, their suppliers, to their community, to the planet. And I don't think I need to say any more about that right now, because we're seeing so many wonderful expressions of love into the community, and by default some expression of love to our planet as well, with so much limited travel. But another thing to think about, how do you bring love more broadly? And then Coombe was asked by many people, okay, this is great, sounds like it's a really good concept, how do I get it into my organization? And he said, whoa, stop, it's out there, you just need to look for it. And a bit like a Wi-Fi signal, you don't always see it, but you need to try and amplify it. So looking for those acts of love, those things that are going on that you can either replicate or recognize. And I've just picked a few examples of things I've seen recently out there that particularly like the working remotely, which I think was Elsevier publishing, showing that care for people who are working from home and recognizing and empathizing with the challenges that they're facing around trying to balance, home and life, and the whole challenge of the children coming onto the Zoom calls and all those things. And just the other day, one of our clients was saying that having Zoom calls and spending a few minutes just checking in, really encouraging that care and compassion, and encouraging people to express how they're feeling, for people to start to engage in joint or assisted problem solving around some of the things that they're dealing with, just really changes the dynamic. And seeing, the dog walk in, or the kid walk in, or the husband walk in with a cup of tea, which I was expecting my husband to do just then, but I didn't get one. It's kind of shows the human side of people, shows that, brings that broader self to work. So, maybe Zoom is going to help us in that respect. But question for you, what acts of love are you seeing in the workplace right now? It'd be lovely to hear some of your thoughts, because I think there's a lot going on, and it's a great chance to recognise and celebrate those. So any that you've got to share, please do, because we've got lovely comments coming in. Yes, so explore these webinars. Yep, brilliant. More personal sharing. Wonderful, wonderful. Yeah, so keep those ideas coming. So I thought as we come to the end, I'd just share some questions, I suppose, and thoughts about what can we be doing to bring more love to the workplace. And some of them are sort of the bigger things, what are your policies and practices doing? Do they foster greater affection, care and compassion? At an organizational level, what do you think your organization's doing? How can you bring that into different parts, particularly in big organizations where they do feel a little bit less loving? I think in smaller organizations, family organizations, perhaps the military, some of these organizations, it's easier to show those things, but how can you bring some of those? But what can you also do to amplify the love that exists? And what are the emotional signals that you're sending out? Karen talked about anxiety contagion. So what can you be doing to think about the emotional blueprint that you're setting, and how you're conveying love or affection or other things? And are you being an amplifier or a dampener or a balancer? And then finally, what are the small moments that you can create to cultivate a culture of love? So are you being emotionally present? So at the moment, it's very easy for us to get distracted. We're so connected. We've got our phones and we've got chat and we've got video. But the gift of love, of just being present, is huge. So how can we just be more present? And how are you taking time to listen to others, especially when there's so many painful emotions at the moment, or conflict? Listening again can be a real gift of love. And are there opportunities to express your gratitude and appreciation, or to recognize and celebrate the uniqueness that every person brings to your organization or to your community? And then I think Daniel Goleman talks about the compassion triad. So how can you notice people? How can you feel or step in their shoes? But also, how can you act? How can you help them to get out of whatever situation they're in? And I think last but not least, how can you show yourself some love? What are you doing to take care of yourself in all of this? So again, in chat, if there's anything that you think that is a really great tip, or something you're doing that you find helpful or you've seen, please do share, because these are the types of things that we can all benefit from. So as is our practice in these digestives, I really need to put my teeth in today. We tend to share a poem, and one that hopefully has some resonance. And so I have one that I know we normally read them twice, once to listen to the words and then to get the meaning. But actually, this is a fairly long poem, so I will only read it once. But it's Maya Angelou, and it's Alone. Lying thinking last night how to find my soul a home, where water is not thirsty and bread loaf is not stone. I came up with one thing, and I don't believe I'm wrong, that nobody but nobody can make it out here alone. Alone, all alone. Nobody but nobody can make it out here alone. There are some millionaires with money they can't use. Their wives run round like banshees. Their children sing the blues. They've got expensive doctors to cure their hearts of stone, but nobody, no nobody, can make it out here alone. Alone, all alone. Nobody but nobody can make it out here alone. Now, if you listen closely, I'll tell you what I know. Storm clouds are gathering, the wind is going to blow. The race of man is suffering, and I can hear the moan, because nobody but nobody can make it out here alone. Alone, all alone. Nobody but nobody can make it out here alone. So, being very conscious of time and respectful of your time, I just wanted to say huge thank you to Karen for a wonderful session and many habits and practices. And thank you so much for everybody for joining today. And please tune in. Mike, I didn't know whether you wanted to give a quick preview of what you'll be doing next week for your session on navigating polarities and dilemmas.
We're talking about dilemmas next week, yes. So Karen alluded to some of those in our relational setting, but next week we'll be talking about dilemmas, and we've got a tool for you around getting the best of both rather than falling into either or ways of thinking and acting.
And just one other thing, Mel, in the sixth session, our last session of the sixth, we're going to be talking more broadly about social resilience. So we'll take this idea of how do you spread out the practices of relational resilience into a wider context like your organisation or your family.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Karen. And thank you, everyone. So stay safe, stay well, spread the love.